kind of picked it up, particularly the one that said, we sort of have a plan coming through, but we aren't there yet, and therefore it's risky. And I think that's absolutely right. From my point of view, what are we trying to do? First of all, we talked a minute ago in the US about the Osborne and Gabler book, the Reinventing Government program that the then president took on. About the same time, the In Search of Excellence book came out, and one of the phrases in that about implementing a tight, loose framework in corporate regimes came out, and that's what Francis Maude has adopted as the core piece of his agenda as our minister. He talks about the tight, loose framework being tight, meaning there are handfuls of things that you get hold of, and you make sure that government does it the same way right across the board and doesn't have the freedom to do it differently. Loose means you genuinely devolve power, preferably away from departments and closer to citizens, and that the two of those things together cause the political philosophy that they're now pursuing to come together. He also argues that Tony Blair's government had a tight, loose framework, but he said they used to do it 180 degrees opposite to where the coalition is. Under Blair, he would argue, I'm not giving a political speech, just what he says, the tightness was in the policy delivery. In other words, things like health service reforms, education reforms, were driven very strongly from number 10 and gripped very strongly at the centre. The looseness was in the sort of corporate side of government, the way government employed people, procured things, managed itself, bought property, which was highly devolved through departments to arm's length bodies and beyond that to wider groups. Francis argues that was 180 degrees the wrong thing to do. What you should be doing is the opposite, tightly gripping the business side of government and highly devolutionary on the policy side of government. Now, you can believe that or not, but that's the argument, and that underpins their philosophy. Therefore, he's come in and said, we need to get a grip on all those things about how you run the place that traditionally have been highly devolved. Hence, draconian measures have been implemented right from the beginning about moratoriums, thou shalt not do any more of this full stop, or approval regimes where if you want to buy a cup of tea, you've got to get permission for it. Whatever it is, it's kind of very tight controls. At the same time, we're trying to look at how we can centralise certain things like procurement. Philip Green's review came on board and talked about centralisation of category-level procurement, used the government's purchasing power to buy once on behalf of government. Very good example of that being the energy procurement that used to be bought individually by departments and arm's-length bodies, was aggregated, has been purchased once on behalf of government, and has saved £500 million a year in the result. So, you know, more of that is very much. So that's the kind of tightness of the thing. The looseness is then the policy reform agenda, which, if you look at it across, is quite radical. In health service, it's about having a much more devolved local health service. In education, it's about freeing schools from local authorities to allow parents and others to take control of their own schools. In justice and policing, it's about election of police commissioners, greater reforms in the community to rehabilitate offenders. And you can go around, you know, right across government, and you're seeing that same message coming through. All I'm hearing is complaints about the tight end of the framework. Some of my permanent secretary colleagues, with their usual wit, turned tight loose into tight noose. As they said, you know, you're seizing up government, you're not allowing it to function at all, blah, blah, blah. And they're equally worried about the devolution of all the policy because, you know, it's untested and uncharted waters, and a lot of accountability questions are being asked. Who's accountable for what happens when something goes wrong in an area in local public policy? So one of the reasons I think you get the questions as you answered them on there, the sort of sense that in places we're being overly controlling, and in other places, quotes, ignoring advice. It's because of those two phenomena. I think it's a culture change for us to be thinking about these things the other way around. So tight loose is the first big theme of how we're operating. Underneath that, I'm just going to give you a list of three, and then you can throw questions back at me. First is, we have talked for years and years and years about trying to get more for less. I'm trying to ban that phrase. It's a phrase that works when you're less. Your idea of less is maybe to have a flat cash settlement or slightly reduced growth from what you've been used for. When you're trying to reduce budgets by 35-40%, you cannot carry on doing the same thing in the same way. You have got to do it fundamentally differently. And if you do it fundamentally differently and it's worse than it was, you end up with a less for less type environment, which nobody wants. So the opportunity here is, given the financial pressures that we're all under, can we use that to do those things that we, in our heart of hearts, know will be better if we do them this way, but may in the end have been harder to implement in a growing world? A great example of that are the justice reforms. Ken Clarke has outlined all his reforms. You've probably seen that the Tory right, aided and abetted by the Sun and others, are having a good go at those policies, because they see it as going soft on crime and reversing the theology that prison works. In the Justice Department, they believe that the reforms they're implementing are not only cheaper to run, they're actually better for society. They're better because if you can manage your reoffending in a different way, if you lock people up on this revolving door of into prison, usually from a drug-related crime, still get drugs inside prison, come out again within 6 months, reoffend, repeat, that cycle goes on forever. That's not a cheap way to run a justice system, nor is it an effective way of getting correctional policy and rehabilitation policy. If you actually can start to think about ways in which you can help people with drug-addicted problems or people who've fallen into bad ways to get out of the cycle of crime without putting them in prison, it's cheaper and it's potentially more effective. Now, it's not an easy answer. The US, since we have a US guest here, actually has more prisons per head of population than I think anywhere in Earth outside of perhaps North Korea. And we have been drifting in that direction over many years. We used to be in the pack with the rest of the European countries, and we've been building more and more prisons and having a higher prison population. And I think the Justice Department would argue, and there are probably people here in this room from there, there's no evidence that that policy has been working. The cycle of repeat offenders is still continually high. So this is the chance to do something that's better, with a better outcome, even though it's going to cost less money as well. So that's first thing, better for less. Second theme, I get asked a lot of questions. So if you want to be more efficient here, and what you've got to do is invest in lots of efficiency programs, i.e. spend money to save it. Excuse me, and I'm saying exactly the opposite. First of all, the Treasury have seen a lot of these so-called spend-to-save cases over many years, and they would argue quite justifiably, in my opinion, there's been a lot of spending and not much saving. And actually, what people do in their normal lives is if they want to spend something, they save up for it. So I'm trying to invert that thinking and say save to spend, not spend to save. In other words, we know we have a declining financial settlement for the next 3 or 4 years. If we want to invest in something, we have to save harder and faster against that curve to free up cash to be able to spend and invest in new things. We all have a reduced financial settlement that roughly goes down a quarter each year for the next 4 years. Well, maybe we should take it down half in the first year to give ourselves more space in the system to actually invest in new programs. So saving to spend rather than spending to save is the second message. Great example of that has been what we have done centrally with help from the 5 big spending departments is call all the suppliers of government in. We started with the top 20 suppliers to government who collectively, on whom we spend about £10 billion a year, and we just sat them down and said, we want money off the bill. This is not about, some deal to extend contracts or, some trade. The country needs you. This is your chance to help us, and we expect you to come back with your propositions for how you're going to reduce your bills to us with no deterioration in service. We've virtually completed that now and effectively achieved £800 million savings in 1 year, this year, and we only started halfway through the year. So we've probably got an annualised reduction of something like 15% without doing anything other than calling the guys in and applying the thumb screws a bit and really, just doing what all commercial businesses do all of the time with their supplier base. And as a result, we have now freed up some cash that can then be, means that other parts of the system don't have to bear the brunt of the cuts. And that's, in effect, an example of saving to spend. And the third and last area that I want to talk about is so-called operational excellence, which means if we are going to do the sort of public service things that we want to do, and the reason most of us came into public service, better schools, health service, etc., we have to be operationally really top class and excellent behind the scenes. We are not that today. I don't think anybody would sit there and look around their departments or their arm's length body and say, we are a shining example of operational excellence. We know that in our heart of hearts. Why do we know it? Because we know how long it takes to do basic things, how many people get involved, how decision-making isn't done sharply and quickly and timely enough. We also know that we operate under perceived rules that cause us all to do silly things or things that we don't like. Procurement rules is the usual one that people come up with. Why does it take us a year to procure anything? And everybody goes, well, that's European law, and shrugs and carries on doing it the same way. Why do we have so many more people in HR than any other part of the economy? Question, because we don't have the right sort of processes and systems in HR to enable ourselves to operate more lean and mean. I could go on, for hours on this, but this is the area in which we have to all sharpen our act up and get ourselves smarter in the way we operate, so that we spend less cost ourselves, but in so doing, making better and quicker decisions that then reach the front line in a much faster way. And again, the sort of example we talked about, you highlighted it on the question, we have been talking about doing shared back office services since I first came to government in 2004, and we're still talking about it as though it hasn't happened. Now, there has been progress, but it's glacial rather than, rapid. And now is the time, I think, to start to grasp these things and change the way we operate inside our own organisations if we are to achieve that sort of excellence that goes with being an efficient organisation. So putting all that together, government's tight loose framework, tight on the business of government, the mechanisms for running the show, much looser in terms of devolutionary on the public service reform agenda, very much focused on saving money to spend it in the future, becoming operationally excellent, and doing those reforms that make us not just spend less money, but better in terms of the public outcomes. And that's the kind of philosophy that the current government is implementing, and which our job is to help coordinate across departments.